Welcome back. Here is now our second video for July 14th, 2016, and we're now going to talk about some of the earlier Athenian history that becomes relevant for the playwright Aeschylus, whose works you read for today. So today we're looking at the history of Athens prior to the Persian Wars and then the actual Persian Wars themselves. Before we continue, I would like you to pause your video and please go to Sakai. You should go to your schedule and please make sure that the outline is open for the schedule for July 14th, 2016, because if you scroll down, you will find a list of events that are relevant for Athenian history. So please pause your video and pull up that portion of the Sakai schedule for July 14th, 2016. Okay, do you have that? Make sure that you see where the outline is. Now, I'm not going to cover everything that is in that outline in order to keep this video relatively brief. I will hit upon the most salient points that relate to the Persian Wars in Athens that essentially defined the way Athens would develop as a polis in the 400s BC, the classical period of Greece. It's important to at least understand that on a relatively basic level, especially because these wars were so central to the figure of Aeschylus. As you remember, he served at two of the major wars, Marathon and Salamis, 490 BC and 480 BC. So we're going to give this highlight of Greek history so that you can get some understanding of how Aeschylus' own history developed in the Persian Wars and how that affected his writing of tragedy thereafter. So first of all, we usually associate Athens with democracy. But in fact, Athens was not always a democracy. In fact, in its early days, Athens was actually ruled by kings. You may remember that we had the story of Theseus, one of the heroes whom you looked at chapter 10 in your Harris-Plotzner textbook. Theseus was in fact a king of Athens, but he actually carried out an act that is given to you in your handout, synoicism, whereby he combined all of Attica, the territory around Athens, together under political oversight of Athens. He also handed a lot of his power to the people of Athens so that they could essentially run the city, as it were, democratically. We see Theseus show up in Sophocles' play Oedipus at Colonus, not unfortunately in your textbook, but you can find it on the Perseus database. Theseus comes in and essentially gives Oedipus a place to die and honor and have his tomb there near Athens. And so Athens is given a great honorific in Sophocles' final play. Of course, we'll talk more about Sophocles next Monday when we get to his handout. So now, you have kings, but then starting in 684 BC, we have these rulers called archons, who are elected annually. And one of the most famous archons was Solon in 594 BC. Solon changed the government around in order to try to help with the problem of debt, because a lot of landowners in Athens and around were getting into debt because farming is just that risky a way of living, and many farmers were not able to pay off their debts properly. And so Solon changed the government to have 4 property classes that essentially defined how one stood in society based on how much property one had, and also what kinds of offices one would be entitled to run for, plus marriages across families. In essence, Solon tried to give both sides, the wealthy people of Athens and the poorer people of Athens, something. The unfortunate effect was he really didn't give enough to either, so he made both of them unhappy. But Solon claimed that he had accomplished what he termed eunomia, E-U-N-O-M-I-A, eunomia in Athens, which basically means good government. He thought so anyway. And he even left the city of Athens for 10 years in order to give the Athenians a chance to try out this new government. And in fact, When he did so, he insisted that the Athenians needed to leave the government in place and not actually change it. Well, the government did not stay in place for too long. Eventually, this fellow showed up on the scene. You have heard of me mention him before, Pisistratus. Pisistratus held a position in Athens called tyrant. And again, it's important to emphasize that a tyrant was not necessarily a bad ruler. A tyrant was somebody who came into a city and essentially replaced the government with his own rule, extra legally. He did not get in through family connection or by election or by any other means. But his rule could still be quite good. Pisistratus actually had to do it 3 times before he finally stuck in 560 BC, and he did a great deal to refurbish the city of Athens during his tyranny. And so he was considered one of the most successful rulers in Athens. His son continued his rule 527 after 527 BC when Pisistratus passed away. His son Hippias also ruled as tyrant quite successfully, but then there was an assassination attempt against Hippias in 514 BC. Hippias himself was not actually targeted. His brother Hipparchus was actually the one killed. After that, however, Hippias became a real tyrant, the way we think of it, and he was eventually exiled in 511 BC. Thereafter, there was a power struggle between Athens and Sparta, with Sparta, the king, Cleomenes, trying to put a ruler of Athens that would represent Spartan interests. That guy's name was Isagoras. Isagoras came in, but then Isagoras' opponent, Cleisthenes, got popular support from the Athenians, and eventually the Athenians, as a body, told the Spartans to get Isagoras out, that they wanted Cleisthenes in instead, and eventually the Spartans rather meekly took away Isagoras, and Cleisthenes ended up becoming Archon of Athens at that point. Cleisthenes then completely changed the government around, once again, to now have 10 tribes of Athens all around Attica. And these 10 tribes were responsible every year for electing a general, so that there were 10 generals, 10 generals altogether, who would take care of military affairs, but who would also be very prominent politicians and who would be responsible for proposing policy during the Athenian assembly. Infrequently, the assembly was simply the general population that would listen to proposals put to them and would then have to vote. So these generals were now responsible for that. Now, during this period, there had been a lot going on over in the east. You may want to get your map out at this point so that you can follow along where the city of Miletus is in the eastern Aegean Sea. It's along the west coast of Asia Minor. Now, those cities over there, like Miletus and Ephesus, were cities referred to as Ionian. And the Athenians had a myth that said that the Ionians existed back in those Dark Age days when, remember, the Dorians came in. You remember from a previous video that we had the so-called Dorian invasion coming in. The Dorians came in, the Ionians fled from them, went through Athens, departed from Athens through the Piraeus harbor, went across the Aegean Sea. So let's see, it'll be this way for you. That way. And went over to Asia Minor. When they got over there, they founded new cities. But the Athenians claimed that they always had some kind of political connection over those cities because they had, in fact, come from here to there. So here's Athens, here are the Ionians. The Athenians claimed that they over here, see right where Athena's owl is, came over this way, and that the Athenians had that political connection over the Ionians ever since. So now, the Athenians allied with a city called Miletus because when the Persians started coming in from farther over in the east, step by step, the Persian leader was named Cyrus, the famous Cyrus the Great, who conquered the city called Sardis, S-A-R-D-I-S, in 546 BC in the northwestern section of Asia Minor. After that, the Persians started putting pressure on these Ionian Greek cities along the coastline to pay taxes to them and have Persian representatives in their government. So the city of Miletus in 499 BC revolted against that and attempted to throw off Persian rule, and the Athenians allied with the Milesians. Unfortunately, the rebellion failed because of a lot of disorganization among all those different Greek cities, and eventually in 494 BC, the Milesian revolt was quelched, and the Milesians themselves were destroyed. Now, unfortunately, a tragic playwright named Phrynichus made a rather regrettable mistake. The year after the destruction of Miletus, he put on a tragedy called The Fall of Miletus, and it made everybody in the audience break out into tears. As a result, he was fined for wrecking the religious right. And thereafter, the Athenians made a rule that contemporary events could not be used as the subject of tragedy. And that is why Aeschylus's Persians required special permission to be put on, as I mentioned in the other video for today. So, in any event, though, it meant that the Athenians were now basically the target of the Persians because now they wanted to vanquish the Athenians. They actually wanted to get the Athenians for a long time, as well as the Spartans, because both cities were the only two that refused to supply the tokens of earth and water. Earth and water were the tokens of submission to the Persians. Earth representing land, water obviously representing the sea. And the point was that the Persians would dominate that city both by land and by sea. Most of the Greek cities complied with the Persian demand, but not the Athenians and not the Spartans. So now the Persians had their excuse, they thought, to come over and try to defeat the Athenians. The king of Persia at that time was Darius, and he mounted an enormous campaign, both by sea and by land, and after he finally conquered that city, the island of Naxos from before, Naxos had previously been pressured by the Persians to submit and in a previous campaign, and now finally they were defeated. Only after that did Darius then move on to Athens itself. And he landed right outside of the Attic plain near a place called Marathon, 26 miles away from Athens. That's where the 26 miles comes from, with Marathon. Somebody ran that distance from Marathon to Athens to warn the Athenians that the Persians had arrived. The Athenians then tried to get help from the Spartans, and a man named Phidippides ran all the way from Athens to Sparta, probably about a 200-mile distance, to try to get help from the Spartans, and he actually collapsed and died, the story goes, when he arrived. The Spartans, however, refused to offer help because they were observing a full moon festival. In fact, the only city anywhere that helped the Athenians was the Plataeans, and you see them listed here, Plataea. Plataea is a small city in Boeotia near Thebes, but allied to Athens. Thebes and Athens have a very bad history with each other, and so that's a very uncomfortable place for Plataea to be in. So the Athenians were forced to face off against the Persians by themselves at Marathon with only the help of the Plataeans, and they actually ended up beating them, and Darius ended up withdrawing. So that's the Battle of Marathon, 490 BC, and that's the one that Aeschylus participated in. Well, after Darius was beaten, his son Xerxes came back. And Xerxes made an effort to avenge his father by amassing an even larger campaign, again both by land and by sea. And for this attack, the Spartans made an effort to amass resistance at a particular spot. Okay, it's time for Athena's owl. I would like you to pause your video. If you have ever watched the movie 300, you should be aware of the location where the Spartans attempted to make a resistance against the Persians. Pause your video, and without looking anything up, see if you can write down the name of the battle that is depicted at this moment in Greek history in the movie 300. Pause your video. Well, it was right here on the board, Thermopylae. 480 BC. The Battle of Thermopylae was the Spartans' famous effort to, with only 300 leading Spartan warriors, to hold off a gigantic mass of Persians, probably in the hundreds of thousands, not likely in the millions, as is told to us by Herodotus, the historian, but certainly an enormous number. And over 1,200 ships, the ships called triremes, which are the three oared ships, three banks of oars. So, warships. So this was a massive undertaking by the Spartans. They actually almost managed to hold off this mass of Persians coming in one after another. But eventually they were beaten because a Greek guy very traitorously told the Persians about a way to get around to the other side of the Spartans. There was, in fact, a group of people called Phocians who were supposed to block off that pass, but the Phocians fled when the Persians showed up, and so the Persians were able to come all the way around, and eventually the Spartans were caught in a vice between two amassed Persian armies, and when that happened, the Spartans fell, and Thermopylae also fell under Persian control. Unfortunately, Thebes had already, it was called Medized, already switched over to the Persian side, so then the Persians very quickly made their way down through Greece to Athens, bringing up a huge crisis. At this point, we enter another gentleman. Themistocles. Themistocles was general and naval commander at Athens. A few years before this battle, 480 BC, the Athenians had been lucky enough to find a huge motherlode of silver east of them over at Laureum, out in the Spit. And the Athenians wanted to spend the silver on all sorts of projects, but Themistocles, then also general, told the Athenians that they needed to build up the navy. They needed to build ships. And the Athenians were surprised at that, but they went along with it. And it turned out it was a good thing, because when the Persians came down the coast of Greece, past Boeotia to now invade Attica, Themistocles had a plan in place to evacuate all of the Athenians onto their ships and amass them around Salamis and further over down south at Troisdon as well. Now, it's likely that his plans for evacuation didn't really come off as neatly as he was planning. Probably it was forced to be accelerated because the Persians got down faster than was predicted. So as a result, we suspect that the actual evacuation was not as orderly as Themistocles would have liked it. It might have been kind of frantic. Nonetheless, though, he was prepared. And when the Greeks were defeated at another location called Artemisium up north, which was at the same time as Thermopylae, Themistocles had Greek words written on a cliff to tell the Greeks who were in the Persian ranks to be ready to turn on the Persians, because the Greeks knew that there were some of their number among the Persians on the ships, and so they should be ready for a response. So then, when Themistocles had his ships ready, he sent a secret message. It's always remarkable that historians know about secret messages when nobody else does. But in any event, he sent a secret message to Xerxes. Come on in to Salamis. You'll catch the Athenians. They're all bunched up there. And unfortunately for Xerxes, he fell into the trap. He came around with his much heavier ships, and the Athenians sent beacon fires across the Gulf of Salamis, and all the ships came around and massed up and completely defeated the Persians in the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC. Aeschylus was probably there, and Xerxes was forced to flee. The Persians did withdraw at sea, but on land they were still amassed in further northwest in Boeotia, and it would actually take the Spartans through a couple of maneuvers, some of them probably accidental, before finally the Spartans were able to defeat the Persian leader Mardonius at Plataea in 479 BC. And interestingly, that same year, the Athenians also chased the Persian fleet back overseas and defeated them also near Ephesus, back over on the west coast of Asia Minor in Ionian territory, a place called Mycale, 479 BC. That was actually the final defeat of the Persians in this particular campaign. The actual final defeat of the Persians completely did not come until 466 BC, when the Athenian general Cimon in 466 BC was able to round up Persians along the Eurymedon River and finally got them. So, when the Athenians defeated the Persians this way, they, for a period, became ultra powerful in the Aegean Sea, and they quickly went to work amassing a whole network of alliances with cities and islands everywhere. That's going to be the subject of our video coming up on Monday, July 18th, the way that the Athenians tried to take advantage of this new power and prestige that they had been able to amass through these really unexpected, remarkable victories that ended up saving Greece. The Athenians unfortunately went overboard, and it would end up costing not only them, but effectively also the rest of Greece. So that concludes our video series for our third week of our URI online Greek mythology course. I hope you have a good weekend. We'll see you back here on Monday. We will talk about Sophocles, his two plays, and also we will continue our series on Athenian history. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you here on Monday.